Hi, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Tai Kwun. We have a full house tonight, although it doesn't feel like it, at 50% capacity. But thank you all for coming tonight. I'm Chin Chin. I'm the director of Tai Kwun, the Jockey Club CPS Limited. And today I am delighted to reactivate another episode of our Tai Kwun Conversations series after a 9-month hiatus. The Tai Kwun Conversations is a series of talks that brings together the brilliant minds to discuss the challenges and rewards in pursuing a sustainable future through the active management of heritage resources. This was started in November 2019, and we have done 3 sessions where we invited local and international experts to share their knowledge and best practices in the active management of heritage resources, not only in Hong Kong, but also in our neighboring cities like Macau, Yangon, as well as far as France. So if you're interested to also watch these previous episodes, they are all available online at the Tai Kwun website. Now today is a very special one, and today's event marks the launch of a very important book, Crime, Justice and Punishment in Colonial Hong Kong. This is a book published this year by the Hong Kong University Press and co-authored by Ms. May Holdsworth, Mr. Christopher Munn, with the picture researcher Mr. David Bellis, who are all here with us today. This richly illustrated book explores the history of the 3 institutions, the Central Police Station, the Central Magistracy, and the Victoria Prison, all declared monuments of Hong Kong, located on this very site where you're sitting in. The book really weaves together a fascinating historical narrative, not only of the buildings and the institutions that they house, but also the lives of many generations of people, whether they are arbiters of the law, enforcers of order, or the incarcerated, whose lives are forever changed by their experiences here at Tai Kwun. I would like to also take this moment to thank the Hong Kong Jockey Club for their commitment and generosity as the sole funder to the meticulous conservation of these 3 declared monuments, and its continuing commitment to the support of the ongoing operations and programs of the revitalized Tai Kwun as a heritage and arts cultural destination that will make Hong Kong people proud. The Jockey Club is also the generous sponsor of this book's publication. And for those of you who are interested in purchasing a copy, there will be limited signed editions outside at the foyer at the special one-off 30% discount, only for tonight. And the book will continue to be on sale at Tai Kwun's Visitor Center, as well as various outlets at Tai Kwun. And for those of you who are interested to follow us on Tai Kwun Conversations, I'm pleased to announce that our next talk will be in November, and it covers the fascinating story of the arduous conservation and resurrection of the Duddle Street gas lamps after their brutal destruction by the Typhoon Mangkhut in 2018. And there will be a short survey after this talk if you wish to fill that up, and we'll be most appreciative of that, and you would get a very small special gift at the foyer for that. And without further ado, I would like to now introduce Mr. Peter Daniell, publisher of the Hong Kong University Press, who will be the moderator of this evening's talk with our esteemed speakers. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, Chin Chin. Good evening, everyone, and thanks very much for joining us tonight. I'm delighted to introduce our 3 distinguished speakers, May Holdsworth, Dr. Christopher Munn, and David Bellis, who together have produced a hugely enjoyable and wonderfully researched book, Crime, Justice and Punishment in Colonial Hong Kong. The book tells the story of the complex that you're sitting in today, the former Central Police Station, the Magistracy and Victoria Prison, but it also tells the incredible story of Hong Kong through the millions of people who came here into contact with these institutions as defendants, witnesses, victims, and also as prisoners. The book begins by painting a fascinating picture of Hong Kong in its earliest days as a colony. It filled up very quickly with migrants from China and from traders and merchants from around the world. It was teeming with beggars and vagrants as well, and opium dens, and it's described vividly by the authors as being seamy, crowded, chaotic, and poor. The book begins by looking at the police, which at first were a ragtag force of ill-disciplined, mainly European and Indian officers who couldn't really communicate with each other, let alone the people they were supposed to be policing. And but gradually, we see over time, they professionalize, they model themselves on the Metropolitan Police, and they draw more and more local Chinese up the ranks and into the ranks. And I think they became a majority after World War II. The middle part of the book deals with the central magistracy, which dealt with more than 1 million cases in its first 100 years. Everything from petty offences through to committals for murder and piracy. And although the original buildings were absolutely abominable, dirty and overcrowded and unfit for purpose, nobody knew Hong Kong better than the magistrates who dealt with so many ordinary people. And the authors devote a chapter to the most notable cases in that 100-year period. The final part of the book deals with prisons, which Victoria Gaol, which was regarded as a role model for the rest of Asia. Some people thought that it didn't offer any deterrence at all, because prisoners were said to be putting on weight when inside. One report, an official report, said it provided a roomy and clean, roomy quarters and wholesome and nourishing food. But there were many other stories of ill treatment and overcrowding, and the experience of the Chinese prisoners, many of whom were inside for really petty offences, non-payment of fines, that was quite different from their European counterparts who were in a segregated part of the prison. Over time, we see the discriminatory laws of curfews and banishments being rolled back. We see the racist punishments of queue cutting and the stocks being abolished, and the public floggings and executions that happened around these buildings, they were abolished as well. But best of all in this book are the colourful stories of prison escapes, of celebrated cases, of wicked crimes. You've got the detail of the prison menus of congee, curry, or gruel, depending on your race. You've got instructions on how to use the awful punishments, the crank, oakum picking, and the shot drill. And you've got the gossipy articles of the time, and also the richly drawn profiles of the many magistrates and superintendents who served here. It's a meticulously researched, academically robust book that delivers on many levels. The authors have poured through reports, judgments, letters, articles, and pulled together a huge number of illustrations to paint a very rich picture. And we're very lucky to have them here today to illuminate us further on the incredible story of Tai Kwun. For those who don't know our speakers already, May Holdsworth is a long-established author who's written many well-reviewed books on Hong Kong and China, including The Hong Kong Story and Foreign Devils, Expatriates in Hong Kong, the Dictionary of Hong Kong Biography that she co-edited with Chris, which profiled Hong Kong's famous and infamous characters of yesteryear, and also a number of books on Chinese history and heritage, including The Palace of Established Happiness and Restoring a Garden in the Forbidden City, and Women in the Tang Dynasty. Christopher Munn, after reading history in Oxford and obtaining his PhD from Toronto, Chris came out to Hong Kong to work for the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, while also establishing himself as a historian of some note. He wrote the widely praised book, Anglo-China, Chinese People and British Rule in Hong Kong, and also more recently, A Special Standing in the World, A History of HKU's Faculty of Law. And last but by no means least, David is the founder of the very popular local history website Gulo, which contains 20,000 images of old Hong Kong that David has somehow managed to collect over the years. He's recently assembled his pictures into a series of photo books called Old Hong Kong Photos and the Tales They Tell. And many of the lovely illustrations that you see in the book are down to David's keen eye for detail and storytelling. On behalf of the panel, I'd like to extend my thanks to the Jockey Club for commissioning this work, and also to Tai Kwun Arts for sponsoring this event and for all their support since publication. In terms of the order of events, May's going to speak first, then Chris, and then David, and then there'll be a 30-minute Q&A. The book is still available in the foyer for sale at a very special discount if you want it. And I think without further ado, May is going to tell us a little bit about some of Victoria Jail's most famous prisoners, and also the story of William Quincy, one of Hong Kong's most colourful police inspectors of the 19th century. May.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for the generous introduction, Peter. We're here to launch a book, and we'd like to thank the Jockey Club here and now for commissioning the book back in 2012. The book has a very long title, which is designed to capture the many themes and illustrations contained in it. That's hardly surprising when the time span covered begin at the colonization of Hong Kong and ends in the early years of the 21st century. Here's an engraving of Hong Kong Harbour from 1844, a jail or prison with high walls on four sides, was one of the first buildings to be erected in the new colony. Can you see that? It's just below the flagpole. The walls surrounded what is more or less the same site as that occupied by Tai Kwun today. If only the walls could talk. We have no time to listen tonight, however. Instead, I shall confine myself to the heritage of names, to executions on site, and to a few of the people who crop up within the pages of the book. These are a policeman, a murderer, and three famous prison inmates. But first, I shall make an etymological detour. I was curious to discover if there were other meanings attached to the Jockey Club's branding of this complex as Tai Kwun, to unpack the name, so to speak. The Jockey Club's own website says this about the naming. Tai Kwun in Chinese means big station, the colloquial name used by police officers and the public to refer to the police and the former law enforcement complex, and so on. The name was adopted by the Jockey Club as a reminder of the historical importance of the compound. Historical importance made me think of heritage, not least because many of these Tai Kwun conversations revolve around heritage conservation. So let's reflect on heritage. Here's a definition that goes beyond buildings and traditions and includes languages. The origin, derivation, and development of words and phrases over time are, I suggest, part of a society's cultural heritage. In a Chinese website, I found an interesting literary reference to Tai Kwun in a Qing dynasty novella. Cantonese sojourners in Hong Kong call police stations Tai Kwun. This suggests to me two things, well, actually three things. First, Hong Kong was regarded as a foreign territory, the Chinese here being considered by other mainland Chinese as sojourners, transients, which to a large extent they were. The difficulty of governing and controlling crime among a migrant population which flowed freely between Hong Kong and China is repeatedly mentioned in 19th century colonial records. This is also why, for a long time, Hong Kong possessed one of the largest police forces in the British Empire. Secondly, the Tai Kwun term is specifically Cantonese. Thinking further about Chinese terms for police, I unpack a third point. This relates to the phrase for police station used in the novella, 准保房. The three characters are there picked out in red. As you see from the dictionary definition, 准保房refers to a police station in former foreign concessions. Thus, treaty ports, particularly Shanghai, as well as the colony of Hong Kong. My co-author, Chris, came up with Chinese translations of some official titles in Hong Kong in 1874, which showed that the term 准保 was used here too. The Captain Superintendent of Police is 准保官, Gun being the word for official. The Central Police Station, the one here, is 准保厅, Tang meaning a government department or office. According to a Chinese scholar of criminal justice, the modern Chinese police force, which was not born until the end of the 19th century, follow the models of modern police forces established in Western countries. As Peter mentioned just now, the Hong Kong police force was modeled on the Metropolitan Police in London. In the foreign concessions, particularly Shanghai, Western residents were subject to their own laws and their own police. Hong Kong played its part, supplying a number of British and later Sikh policemen to the Shanghai Municipal Police, a special force in the international settlement in Shanghai. Connections between Shanghai and Hong Kong police forces operated on several levels. As noted in our book, in the 1930s, the Hong Kong police were given defendu classes in the gymnasium of Headquarters Block, which now houses the upscale restaurants Chinese Library and The Statement. Defendu is a martial arts self-defense system developed to train the Shanghai Municipal Police. Into this world of foreign concessions steps the first of my personalities, William Quincy. Don't be misled by his name. William Quincy, as you can infer from the photograph, was Chinese. He was orphaned during the Taiping Rebellion in the 1850s and 1860s. General Charles Gordon, or Chinese Gordon, while fighting to suppress the rebels, found him near Kunshan in Jiangsu province, sort of adopted him, took him to England, and provided for his education. His name Quincy may have been inspired by his native place, Kunshan. In Jiangsu, it would have been pronounced Kunse, which sounds quite like Quincy. General Charles Gordon, who never married, was renowned for being keen on scooping up street urchins and bringing them up as Christians. Quincy eventually joined the Hong Kong police as a member of the Eurasian contingent. He did very well, was made inspector in 1884, and was particularly active in bringing illegal gambling dens to book. In 1897, however, he was himself implicated in a gambling scandal when many junior and senior policemen were found to be on the take. Along with those European, Indian, and Chinese police officers, Quincy was compulsorily retired for corruption. But this hardly fazed him. The year after his dismissal, Quincy was recruited by the administrative head of Shanghai, the mayor, if you like, to organize a modern police force there. In 1902, he was invited by the powerful general and viceroy Yuan Shikai to establish a similar police force in Baoding in northern China. Quincy eventually returned to Shanghai and took a job as superintendent of the Shanghai-Nanjing Railway Police. He died in 1923. A more direct translation of Tai Kwun is big house. And that stirred a memory in me of hearing the English phrase used as slang for prison. I looked it up. Sure enough, big house is a high security prison or penitentiary. In the slang thesaurus, it's found in a section entitled Prison Life. The largest prison in Scotland, Barlinnie, is widely known as Big House, or rather Big Hoose. My unpacking of the term Tai Kwun may seem rather contrived, but I still like to think that it could refer to both the police station and the jail. Not only that, it had other connotations. In the past, people would have uttered Big House or Tai Kwun in terms of fear and loathing. My detour stops here. Before I focus on the murderer and prisoners mentioned earlier, I shall digress once more. In 2012, when we told friends, the Jockey Club had commissioned us to research and write a history of the Central Police Station, Central Magistracy, and Victoria Gaol, we were invariably asked two questions. One, is the jail haunted? And two, where did hangings take place? To the first question, the answer must be, we don't know. Although a newspaper in 1926 reported that a police interpreter claimed he saw a ghost, a tall, dark figure in a long black coat, but with no legs or feet, gliding across the floor of the Central Police Station. The answer to the second question, yes, hangings were indeed conducted on this site, initially in the northeast corner of the Central Magistracy. Here's an artist sketch we commissioned, which didn't in the end make it into the book. But it gives a clear impression of the scaffold on a platform with hundreds of spectators massed under the retaining wall on Arbuthnot Road. In around 1856, with no intervening buildings, hangings on Arbuthnot Road could be seen from Cane Road running along above it. Executions provoke revulsion or ghoulish fascination. But there was a purpose to conducting them in public. They were meant to strike onlookers with terror, to have a deterrent effect. In 1879, executions moved to a yard in front of the main hall of the jail, the one we call D Hall today, with a gallows erected in the space between D Hall and Barrack Block. Public hangings were not abolished until 1895. For this illustration, the condemned man we had in mind was Charles Newman, an American unemployed watchman. In 1878, he killed his friend, Servando Gutierrez, in a jealous rage with a tomahawk. He thought Gutierrez had become too friendly with his girlfriend, Louisa Lockhart. He then gave himself up to the police, and while waiting his trial in Victoria Gaol, he pretended to be insane. He never spoke, refused to take solid food, stripped naked, and smeared his body and the prison walls with excrement. And when he knew he was being watched by the warders, he twitched and trembled dramatically, as though he had a kind of palsy. He kept up the pretense for 3 months, but was hanged anyway on 19 December 1878. A day before his execution, he was baptized a Roman Catholic. The priest who baptized him, Father Vigano, you can see him, gave him the last rites. The hangman with a hood over his head was a European prisoner. More than 600 people, Chinese and Europeans, but mainly Europeans, watched the hanging from outside the compound on Arbuthnot Road. Inside, just below the scaffold, there would have been a number of police officers, warders, and other prisoners. We have a graphic description of another hanging of a murderer and 3 pirates in 1867. I have time to read only the last bit. The voice of the Roman Catholic padre was drowned in a torrent of abuse from the scaffold. At 6:05, at a signal from the sheriff, the boat was drawn, the fatal jerk given, and the miserable victims were left dangling in the air. This image shows 4 pirates in court. They were among the 50 pirates hanged in the 1860s, probably including the 3 mentioned just now. I said earlier, if only the walls could talk. Prison walls especially. And they almost do when you go into the conserved prison blocks today. E Hall, just a few steps from this building, may boast behind bars, a bar and cafe situated in a series of linked cells where you can order a glass of Bordeaux, if not bread and water. Still, it still retains a chilling resonance, to me at any rate, because I have read some prison narratives. My first famous prisoner is Ho Chi Minh, the communist leader revered in Vietnam. He was in Victoria Jail briefly. For most of his stretch, he stayed in hospital in Bowen Road on Hong Kong Island. A softer option for someone who had not actually committed a crime, but was nevertheless regarded as an undesirable troublemaker wanted by the French police in Indochina. He found the time he did spend in Victoria Jail desperately tedious. He devoted his nights to catching bedbugs. They stopped him from sleeping. Even when he got used to them, he continued trying to catch them, less for the pleasure of killing them than for passing the time. Tai Wan, Chinese poet, was incarcerated in Victoria Jail by the Japanese for his anti-Japanese activities in Hong Kong. He was imprisoned for only 3 months, but the bad treatment there affected his health. He died aged 45. I reproduce one verse from his poem inscribed on the prison wall from 1942. Less strong as a poem than as a historical document, I think. The last of my prison inmates is Ai Wu, a leftist writer who wrote an essay describing a night in what he called a free government hotel. At the time, Victoria Jail housed overseas Chinese deported from a third country to China. As Ai Wu was one of 80 political deportees from British Burma who was transferred to China through Hong Kong in 1931. His offense was his support of a Burmese peasants' revolt. Ai Wu and 6 other inmates were crowded into one small cell, smelly cell. Instead of a lavatory, the inmates were provided with a tin plate chamber pot, which in the evening had overflowed with urine and other unmentionables. To Ai Wu, viewing this through the perspective of his left-wing ideology, Victoria Jail was a mirror image of the racism and brutalities of imperialism. He damned his jailers as foreign devils and red-haired barbarians. The next day, on a ship bound for Munn, he said his lasting impression of Hong Kong was the viciousness of imperialism and the filth and stink of the chamber pot. Goes without saying that Victoria Jail was not a very nice place, and I haven't even got to punishments, flogging, hard labor, solitary confinement, prison food, riots, breakouts, self-harm, and suicides. Well, some other time, perhaps, or you can read the book. Thank you.
Thank you very much, May, for that. That was very evocative and very interesting. Next we have Chris, who's going to be telling us a little bit about some of magistrates in Hong Kong from the 1850s onwards, and we'll also talk about some of the categories of crimes that they faced in Hong Kong, from opium and curfew breaches and illegal gambling as well.
Thank you, Peter. And I'd like to join May and Peter in thanking the Jockey Club for commissioning the book, and especially to thank Peter himself and all of the friends at Hong Kong University Press for getting the book published. And thank you all for attending. I'd also like to mention a few people who contributed to the book. I don't think any are here today, but I'll mention them because they either helped with the research or provided some technical input on architecture and other matters. These are Danny Chung, Peter Hamilton, and Hannah Keane, the research assistants, and Brian Anderson, Heather Jeremy, and Michael Morrison, who helped with the material on architecture and conservation. As Peter said, I'm going to say a few words about the work of the magistracy and its relationship with the police and the jail. First, I'll explore the career of one of the magistrates in the century or so when the magistracy here was the centre of criminal justice in Hong Kong. And then I'll make a few comments on the kind of justice that they were meting out. Now, it's a difficult choice to find a representative magistrate. There are well over 100 who sat in the central magistracy during the 120 years or so covered by the book. Let's take a quick look at a few of them before we narrow in on our sample magistrate. First of all, Ng Choi, one of the most famous magistrates in colonial Hong Kong, and I think this is probably one of the most famous pictures in the Hong Kong history books. He only served for 1 year, but he's significant because he was the only Chinese magistrate in the 100 years before World War II. He met all 3 of the standard requirements for a magistrate at this time. He was legally qualified, he knew the Chinese language, and he was familiar with Hong Kong. But he moved on to much greater things in China. Our second magistrate is Francis Hazeland, who was the first judicial officer to be born in Hong Kong. He was the son of a solicitor who was also the Crown solicitor, and he was educated at the Central School, and he was fluent in Cantonese. He started off as a clerk, but in 1898 he was called to the bar in England, and from time to time, as well as being a magistrate, he acted as a judge, and even briefly for 19 days as Chief Justice. He was said to be a stickler for demeanour. Some solicitors would rehearse their clients so that they were as innocent looking as possible when appearing before him. The third one is Walter Schofield. Walter Schofield was a government cadet, a class which dominated the magistracy up to 1939. The cadets were the forerunners of today's administrative officers, or AOs. Typically, they were trained in Cantonese, but they knew nothing or very little about the law. Schofield, here pictured not digging himself into a hole, but in his other career as a pioneer archaeologist in Hong Kong. Schofield was a humane man, and he was a leading force in establishing the juvenile courts in Hong Kong in the 1930s. Our fourth character is Law Hin Sing, a barrister and one of a new wave of locally appointed magistrates in the immediate post-war period. This localization trend was not sustained. Lowe was a compassionate, humorous man who did not like sending people to prison. Hong Kong's problems were caused by poverty, he said. They would not be solved by punishment, but by education and more equal distribution of wealth. He was 80 years old when he finally retired, and he lived to be 100. And now H.E. Woodhouse, or Ernest Woodhouse, as he was known to his friends. This is the magistrate I plan to focus on for the rest of my contribution. Woodhouse was another government cadet. In fact, he was one of the first cadets to be recruited in 1867. He had no legal qualifications, yet he became one of Hong Kong's longest-serving magistrates. One of his 4 sons became a police officer in Hong Kong, and another was P.G. Woodhouse, the comic novelist. Woodhouse straddles the 3 institutions we examine in the book. He started off as head of the Chinese police contingent. He was sheriff for a while, which theoretically involved duties in the jail. And his career ended in the magistracy, where he served for nearly 18 years. And for 12 years, he was also head of the fire brigade. Woodhouse was one of the best Chinese speakers in the government. He was hardworking, in excellent health, and by all accounts a decent fellow and a good colleague, particularly with his Chinese staff. For most cadets, a term in the magistracy was just a stepping stone in a glorious career, not an end point. But Woodhouse was repeatedly disappointed in his applications for promotion. He complained continually about his inadequate salary, his rising workload, and the burdens and dangers and wet uniform of being a fire chief. Why then did he remain in this relatively modest position of magistrate, while other cadets were promoted to high office? Well, he had a difficult time with some of the governors. Governor Hennessy in 1880 banned him from Government House, ostensibly because he'd taken a newly arrived cadet to visit a Chinese brothel. Sir William Marsh, who headed the government for long periods in the 1880s, described him as argumentative and oversensitive, and Governor DeVoe thought that he was a very good fire chief, but lacking in judgment, which was a bit damning for a magistrate. This might have had something to do with Woodhouse's erratic decisions in some extradition cases, in which his lack of legal knowledge was exposed. None of this helped, but perhaps the real reason was simply the shortage of plum jobs for cadet officers. Woodhouse was an average performer and something of a straggler. The additional responsibilities heaped on him topped up his salary, but they only added to his pressures. Hong Kong's population grew by 50% during his time as magistrate, and with increased police enforcement, his caseload grew at an even faster rate. So too did the number of fires and inquests. Let's take a look at his workload. These are the figures for 1892, which was an average year. There are about 14,500 defendants, or prisoners as they're all called. That was equal to about 6.5% of Hong Kong's official population. 6.5% was about average for the 19th century. In some years it was 10% or even 11%. Of course, the population was fluid, and some of the prisoners were repeat offenders. The conviction rate was 83%. 44 persons were committed to the Supreme Court for more serious crimes, and only 35 of these were actually tried in the end, and 18 were convicted. I should add here that at this time, Woodhouse usually shared this large caseload with one other magistrate, although often for long periods there would be a single magistrate handling a workload of this size. Here are the detailed figures. There are about 170 different offences here and on the page over. I'm not going to go through every single one of them, but you'll see, if you can read it, that there's everything from child stealing to attempting to commit suicide. I think, as Woodhouse put it, at every point of your lives, the police and the magistrate touch you. Some of these offences would be common at any time and in any place: assaults, larcenies or thefts, disorderly behaviour, and so on. But some of them need explanation. This is an extract from the long list. The offences here account for over 40% of all the defendants in 1892. All of them depended mainly on enforcement by the police or other agencies, and the figures therefore fluctuated from year to year, often quite wildly, depending on enforcement policy. These were also the kind of offences that offered great scope for corruption. First of all, gambling. This was seen as a vice in itself and the cause of other evils. Chinese and British moralists were generally agreed on this, and reflecting this view, the law made most forms of gambling illegal. But the policy fluctuated over the years. In the 1860s, Governor MacDonald instituted a system of licensed gaming houses restricted to Chinese punters. This raked in a huge revenue. Some of it went towards establishing the Donghua Hospital. Some of it paid Woodhouse's salary as head of the Chinese police. But the policy was controversial, and the scheme was abolished in 1872. After that, there was selective enforcement and a good deal of corruption. Pressure grew for tougher measures. A new gambling ordinance was enacted in 1891 with heavy penalties. It was loosely based on English statutes, but like a lot of Hong Kong legislation from the time, it targeted the little man just as much as it did the operators of the gambling dens. The ordinance was strictly enforced, except that the clubs of wealthy Europeans and Chinese were left alone. In 1893, the governor reported that gambling was almost completely suppressed. He was wrong. The policemen were simply operating their own licensing system through syndicated corruption, and this was exposed in the great corruption scandal that May referred to in 1897. Next, opium offences. These were not dangerous drug offences as we know them today, but revenue offences. Up to 1941, a large part of government income came from the retail sale of prepared opium, usually done through monopolies periodically auctioned to big business. Anyone found with contraband opium was in breach of the law. There were stringent penalties and a sophisticated apparatus of enforcement. In addition to the police, the monopolist maintained his own team of excise officers and informers. Chinese men and women were subjected to searches on arrival in Hong Kong. Illicit opium forfeited to the court was handed over to the monopolist. Proceeds from fines could be shared between the monopolist and the informer. More stringent legislation again was enacted in 1891, and from then on, opium offences were among the leading offences in the magistracy, rising to over 3,000 a year in the mid-1900s. And then the light and pass laws. These are quite well known, I think. It was effectively a curfew on Chinese residents, and it was supposedly a crime prevention measure. Chinese were allowed on the streets after a certain time only if they had a government pass and carried a lamp. Enforcement varied depending on the state of law and order. 1892 was a very quiet year. Only 78 people were prosecuted. But after a spate of armed robberies in late 1895, enforcement was stepped up. 1,500 people were convicted in a single month. And in 1896, over 3,000 persons were convicted of being out at night without a pass, the largest single category of offenders by far for that year. This blitz prompted leaders of the Chinese community to call for the curfew to be ended, and in 1897 it was abolished. The other offences, hawkers and obstruction, they perhaps speak for themselves, and so I won't go into detail about those. But why include them here, and why dwell on these offences when they probably only resulted in small fines and a bit of inconvenience? Well, the reason is simple. These and other minor offences sent many thousands of people to prison because they could not pay the fines. This pattern was noticed by Acting Chief Justice Edward Ackroyd in a speech he gave to the Odd Volumes on his retirement in 1895. The Odd Volumes was a kind of literary society, and the event was rather like this evening, except that the governor and the two magistrates were sitting in the front row. They probably expected a mild and humorous speech, but instead, Ackroyd laid into the magistrates. He accused them of imposing excessive fines for trivial offences. People were unable to pay and went to prison. Nearly half of those admitted to prison in 1893 fell into this category, Ackroyd said, and he gave several examples. $50 or 2 months for illegally dealing in rice wine, $7 or 28 days for being without a night pass, $150 or 3 months for possession of a small amount of illicit opium. This was at a time when a labourer was paid about 50 cents a day or less. Ackroyd cited Magna Carta and other authorities to argue that it was against fundamental law to impose fines that were so large that people could not pay. It is oppressive, it is not justice, he said. Far better to allow petty offences to go unpunished than to fill up your jail with men who are not criminals. Woodhouse and his fellow magistrate, Captain Hastings, who were sitting in the front row, were mortified. They wrote to the governor demanding a right of reply in the newspapers. The governor refused to allow this, but he was sympathetic, and the practice continued. Over the next few decades, superintendents of the jail were routinely reporting that 40 or 50% of admissions were for what they described as offences not of a criminal nature. The figure was as high as 77% in 1928, which was a quiet year. This explains, or is part of the explanation, why Victoria Jail was chronically over capacity. And it also explains why, proportionately, Hong Kong's prison population was about 5 times that of England and Wales. And we haven't really begun to discuss the non-custodial sentences, but I think my time is up, and I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. Now to David, who's going to tell us about some of the pictures that he likes the best and surprising things.
Yes, thanks, Peter. Well, when I started on the project back in 2013, May gave me three goals for the pictures we were looking for. Find colour, find surprises, and find quantity, find lots and lots of pictures. So colour first. It's a big book, lots and lots of black and white text. And old pictures tend to be black and white as well, so it can get quite monotonous as you're going through the pages. So the goal was find colour to add a bit of life and break it up. The easiest way to find colour images, of course, is to use modern images. And we've used several from modern photographers, including several from Leung Kar Tai, a local professional photographer. This one you'll recognise, it's off the front cover. It's showing the barrack block. Another of his pictures shows the ladder store. You don't think much about ladders in ordinary life, but when you're behind a prison wall, a ladder suddenly takes on a whole new significance. Now these two pictures were both taken after the site was decommissioned. And of course, while the site was in operation, photography was prohibited, which kind of makes life a bit difficult when you're looking for photos of a site. So May had a good workaround for that. You've seen one example already. She commissioned several illustrators to provide sketches for the book, for those places where we knew we were just never going to be able to find an image. So here's one example. This is from the 1860s. This is up on Chancery Lane, and it's showing prisoners breaking rocks. This is one of the punishments they had to undergo. They're being watched over by a guard there. Another one from the book. This is a real event. It's a successful escape in 1850. We're back to the ladder theme again. It was a successful but short-lived. The two men made it into town, got blind drunk, and were back in prison by the end of the day. So how about these older pictures? Well, this was where we went looking for surprises. As we're looking for the old photos and the old images, trying to avoid those ones that you see again and again in the history books, trying to find something that would be new for the readers. Well, where to find them? But my idea was to go after the private collections, that if we could find people with private collections, these would be things that hadn't been out in public view before. So I run the GULA website, as Peter mentioned, and I put a notice up there, and I explained what I was looking for, and just asked if anyone could help. And we got some great responses, and this is one of my favourites. It's John Pennyfather Evans, and we're interested in him because in 1941 he was appointed Commissioner of Police here in Hong Kong. So his grandson, actually grandson's wife, got in touch and said, well, we've got a scrapbook that he kept while he was here in Hong Kong. Would you be interested in taking a look? Oh, yes, that's exactly what I was looking for. They live in Essex, so next time I was in Britain, I went and paid them a visit and took pictures of all of the pages of the scrapbook. So two surprises then. The first one is this has been tucked away in a family collection. It had never been shown publicly. The second surprise, what's the paper? Any guesses? It's wrapping paper, brown wrapping paper. So not your usual artist supplies. So what's the story behind that? Well, the answer is down here. The signature is A. Savitsky, Stanley, 1942. So Pennyfather Evans didn't arrive at the best time. 1941, of course, was the year the Japanese invaded. And after the Japanese victory, all of the European civilians, and that included the police force, were interned at Stanley, the south side of Hong Kong. One of those policemen was a white Russian, Mr. Savitsky here, and he had artistic talents, and he kept up morale by doing these sketches. He's believed to have done about 300 altogether, and of course he had to use whatever paper he could find. Another page from the scrapbook. So this is Pennyfather Evans up the top here, and these would be the people that he shared a room with for those 3 years, 8 months in Stanley. And it's a nice view of Savitsky's skills. He'd always draw people how they looked outside camp. So it's just a little way of sort of a little bit of escapism for the people who were stuck in internment. They could imagine themselves being back outside. Now, another way that the people in Stanley kept themselves amused was with shows. This is a poster from another family's scrapbook, and it's showing the jail show, which was put on in 1943 by James Norman and Wallace Kinloch. Now, Kinloch was a policeman. James Norman, as the title perhaps suggests, was a young prison officer. After the war, he stayed on in Hong Kong. He rose up through the ranks, and by the 1950s, he'd become Commissioner of Prisons, the top man here. Now, his daughter, Kirsty, got in touch and gave us several photos, including this one of her father in the headquarters. So this would have been taken somewhere in the compound here. It's taken in '63, so that's about 20 years after his show. He'd often hark back to those times at Stanley, and he'd point out he was one of the few commissioners who could say he'd been imprisoned in his own prison, because Stanley Camp actually included the prison officers' quarters for Stanley Prison. Now, we didn't just rely on private collections. We made good use of the public archives too. And this was a real exciting find. It's a scene from 1857. It's Cheung Alam being examined. That was after his Yising bakery supplied arsenic-poisoned bread to the western population of Hong Kong. Now, it's a well-known scene because a version of it, shown here, appeared in the Illustrated London News. That was the big illustrated paper of the day. And I've seen this pop up in several history books. But what I didn't realise was that the original sketch, it's drawn by Baptista, famous artist for the region. The original one still exists. Amazing. It's here in Hong Kong. It's in the collection of the Hong Kong Museum of Art. So as well as looking for the photos, sketches, paintings, all these different artworks are great resources too, and especially for the early days, sort of before photography really gets going. Of the big archives, I'd have to say my favourite one is the UK's National Archives. That's in London, out by Kew. This is one of the documents from their collection, and it's showing a plan for the prison. This is what was proposed, 1858. It's kind of upside down from how we normally look at maps. It's got south at the top, so let's just flip it round. So this is Old Bailey, Chancery Lane, Arbuthnot Road over here. And at the time, the fashion for prisons was the radial design. So you had a central inspection hall, and the wings radiate out from it. And the idea was that the guards could stand here and see anything that was going on in the various wings. So this is well known. I've seen pictures and I've seen it on maps. But what I didn't realize was that originally they planned a mirror image on the northern half of the site. Now you can read about the tussle over this piece of land in the book and how eventually that wasn't built. The dark lines on the map here, on the plan rather, they show the buildings that were in place in 1858. So you can see they're just a collection of small buildings, and this was when a much larger building would replace them. To see what was built, here's another one from their collection. So it's about 40 years later. It's a map from 1897. And then here we are. This is the radial prison as it was finished. Not much left of it now. These two little diagonal wings, they are the ones that went first, and then these two and the tower. And so all that's left now is D Hall here. And this is about where we're sitting. This is JC Cube down here. The place where they had that mirror image planned, so that it went to the police instead. That's the police barracks, barrack block up here. Now without that extra room, as Chris mentioned, the jail was always struggling for enough space. They did expand out here to the west for a while. You can see the new jail on the opposite side of Old Bailey. And one little curiosity, the two sites were linked by a tunnel. There used to be a tunnel under the road here. Another curiosity, the compound at this time anyway didn't extend up to Hollywood Road just yet. So this patch of land up here was still under private ownership. Not for much longer. This would be acquired by the government, and then this is where the headquarters block is up here. Staying with the collection, they've got all sorts really. I mean, right down to building level. These are plans for a building, even older, 1853, tread wheel and gears. So the tread wheel was one of the punishments, and the sort of the monotonous punishments that prisoners would spend their time doing. And the surprise here to me was just the level of detail that the draftsman went to, so you can see exactly how it was going to be used. The archives, UK's archives, have got photos as well. This one's a real sort of rarity. It's not listed in their index. And the only reason we know about it is because Chris had been reading through the document and found these three photos tucked inside. They were just part of a correspondence. So they're kind of they're off the radar. But they're great for us. They're from 1862. And they're showing the view looking up Old Bailey Street. So this is the wall of the jail here, Chancery Lane here, and a prison guard on the right. Now the photos were not sharp enough for us to use in the book, but we were able to hand these to the illustrator. So that picture of the the breaking rocks on Chancery Lane, that was sort of derived from these three pictures. So one looking up Old Bailey, one view along Chancery Lane, and one view Chancery Lane from the other end. So this is Bahinia House on Arbuthnot Road on the corner here. The last example of a picture from the UK's National Archives is one you may well have seen before. This is quite a commonly used picture. I've certainly seen it in other books. Now, at first glance, it's a beautiful example of the radial prison. So here's the inspection tower. These are the little wings. This is what's left today. This is D Hall here. And it might be tempting to say, well, yeah, we've all seen this one before. We won't put it in the book. But a combination of two things. First of all, the copy we get from the archives is such a sharp, such a high quality copy. And you combine that with Chris's knowledge of what was going on at the time. And so there's a real surprise sort of hidden in plain sight down here. So we get a glimpse into the prison yard. And we've got these men in a circle here, but one with a different sort of uniform here. So these are the prisoners. This is the guard. And as far as we know, this is the only surviving photo of the shot drill being performed in Hong Kong. So the shot drill, like the tread wheel, it was another of those monotonous punishments. In this case, the guard would give out the commands. The prisoner would have to stoop down, pick up the shot, which is kind of like a cannonball, a very heavy metal ball, shuffle forward a few steps, put it down on the next stand, and then just do that over and over and over and over again. So yeah, a photo that at first was going to be one that you might just pass by, but actually has a real story to tell. So colour, surprises, and then the last one was quantity. This wasn't to be a book with just a few pages of pictures in the middle, but one that's got pictures throughout. So how did we do? Well, here's a look through the first few pages. We ended up with over 1,000 images to choose from. We couldn't use them all, but we managed to get over 200 into the book, so there's lots of pictures. And I'm really happy with how the finished book looks. So in terms of my thank yous, of course, to the Jockey Club and Tai Kwun for their support, but then to all the people who've shared their photos with us. There have been some real treats that we've seen along the way. To New Century, the people who did the layout, a very attractive layout, and to Hong Kong University Press for the quality of the finished book. I think it looks lovely. There we go. Well, that's the end of my session. Peter, back to you.
Thanks very much, David, and to everyone, actually. We now have some time for questions. There's an awful lot of territory that was covered, so does anyone want to ask, is anyone aching to ask a question? Lynn? Microphone.
A rather trivial question, but I should be very interested in the answer. That photograph of Quincy, was it taken in Shanghai? Yes, it was. The photograph is not actually used in the book. It's founded on the internet. It belongs to the Stuart Lockhart collection in Scotland. It was in Shanghai. It was taken in Shanghai. Rather trivial, as I said. But he was standing by a tree, Trachycarpus fortunei, which is everywhere in Shanghai. It's a street tree in Shanghai, and named after Robert Fortune, who found it in Chusan, which is where my grandparents came from. And I've looked everywhere. I mean, Hong Kong has numerous palm trees, but I've never found a Trachycarpus fortunei in Hong Kong.
Thanks very much for that, Lynn. Does anyone else have any questions at all? Yes, the lady there in the middle.
The poem that you copied and then you put up as a slide, is that something we could see in person somewhere around the jail? The picture of the poem that you put up, the poet who was in the jail, and you showed us the poem that you said you copied off the wall. Is that something we could see in person? Is that somewhere in the jail now?
It is a display of what we call it shadow play, shadow projection.
Microphone, mate.
It is in one of the cell blocks as a bihor as a shadow projection.
Okay, thank you.
The gentleman at the very back there, if we can get to him.
At the risk of sounding a little bit tabloid, can I ask for some more detail on some of the punishments which were meted out? It seemed particularly fascinating. Thank you.
I think oakum picking would be the one to start with. Chris? Oh.
It depends on the time and the decade, but I talked about imprisonment for short periods, and there were fashions from time to time, and flogging was quite big in the mid-19th century, but it went out in the 1870s and 1880s, at least as far as the magistrates were concerned. But one of the interesting ones was punishment by exposure in the stocks, in the leg stocks. I think the last picture in my short presentation showed a couple of women being exposed in the stocks, probably near to whatever crime they'd been convicted of. And the magistrates were given powers to sentence to anyone for any offence to exposure in the stocks. And in the 1900s, this became one of the main primary or additional punishments. It was a few hours in the stocks. And I think in 1904, there's something like 1,000 or more people were sentenced to this punishment. And it became a scandal. People were very resentful of it, particularly since it was only applied to Chinese convicted persons. So there was a campaign against it, and flogging came back in, but it was flogging in private within the jail. Now, other punishments, there are a lot that are described in the book, but within the jail, of course, there was flogging, at least up to the immediate post-World War II period. There was solitary confinement. There was occasionally confinement for certain periods in a darkened cell for breaches of discipline. There were short rations, and so on and so on. Does that help?
May I just add? Peter mentioned oakum picking. This was setting prisoners to unpick rope that were crusted with tar. And apparently Western prisoners were better at it than Chinese prisoners. And it's mentioned by Oscar Wilde in his Ballad of Reading Gaol. He talked about bleeding nails because, you know, after you've done it for hours and hours, trying to untangle rope, it did take its toll on your fingers.
Yes, next question.
You mentioned corruption. Could you give us a feel as to what sort of level of police and prison officer corruption there was, particularly in the 19th century? And you mentioned also the 1897 big corruption case.
I think, is that to you, Chris?
It was common, but it wasn't necessarily as well organized as it was in more recent times. By that I mean the 1960s and 1970s. The big gambling scandal in 1897 And there was a similar one in 1886, involved what was later to be called syndicated corruption, where large numbers of police were paid off directly or indirectly for not taking action against gambling houses. And the unfortunate thing in Hong Kong is that everybody kept accounts and books, and these books were discovered, and they gave a great deal of detail of all of the people involved, and it stretched not quite all the way to the top, but to very high levels. And a large proportion of the police force was involved in this 1897 scandal, a very large percentage, and they couldn't all be disciplined or dismissed, because to do so would have depleted the force so much that it wouldn't have been possible to replace them very quickly. So it was a tough problem to deal with. There were one or two trials, and there were a lot of disciplinary dismissals and so on. But generally, the corruption in the early period was just policemen taking bribes on the streets, helping themselves to things, and having their own rather narrowly focused protection rackets.
Thank you, Chris. Any other? Yes. Gentleman there with the white shirt.
Many years ago, when I was having a tour of the prison, I remember one of the policemen talking about a mango tree and a legend. And I forget what the legend was. Have you come across that concept about when there's a mango growing on a mango tree? The legend?
Timothy, would you like to answer that one?
Thank you. In years when the mango tree would bear a lot of fruit, it was a good omen, and my colleagues in the Heritage Department will correct me, it was a good omen for promotions within the police force, I think.
Yes, gentleman there.
I'm just curious, does the book cover what happened to Tai Kwun during the Japanese occupation period? And also, I presume the prison was one of the first prisons built in Hong Kong. Where were the next prisons built in Hong Kong? I'm just curious.
Who would like to answer that? The answer is yes, it was covered, but I'll let May fill us in.
Yes, the Central Police Station was taken over by the Japanese, and there are several cases of torture enacted there. You can read it in the book.
And in terms of expanding beyond Victoria Jail, the next prisons?
Yeah, the Victoria Jail was the first one, and it was more or less the only one until Stanley Jail was opened in 1937. But there were other attempts. There was a jail built on Stonecutters Island in the 1860s, which was a complete disaster and was abandoned very quickly. There was a sort of extension jail at Lai Chi Kok from, the 1900s? For women, and also from time to time for debtors and others. And there were various proposals to build new jails away from this very valuable site in places like Port Fulam, Round Island on the south side of the island, and in various sites in Kowloon. But they never got off the ground because they were too expensive. And this remained the main jail until 1937. And even after that, it continued as a jail.
Victoria Jail and Central Police Station and all that survived by default, really, because it was never thought that it was worth spending money on prisoners, basically. So the prison continued to be overcrowded, but nobody thought of knocking it down and building anew.
So we're very lucky because of that. Does anyone else have any other questions at all? Yes.
In local communities, especially Hong Kongers, rumors have been generating regarding the former government's house. There's a secret tunnel underneath reaching the Queen's Pier. What about Tai Kwun? Is there any Area 51 yet to be explored beyond your research project? Just curious.
No, I didn't.
Well, David mentioned the tunnel along Old Bailey Street, or under Old Bailey Street. I don't know whether it's still there. I doubt it. But I think there are other secret places, but because they're secret, we don't really know about them, I guess. I'm sorry.
Does anyone else have any questions at all? Yes, gentleman there on the edge.
Yeah, I'd just like to know, how does one get to be appointed as a magistrate? You said earlier that there's no qualification, they don't know about law and so forth, and there's only one Chinese magistrate. Is there also an appeal system?
I think Chris would answer that, but I think it would be interesting to know at what point did it become a professional thing rather than a route for a cadet to go through?
There was debate throughout the 100 or so years before World War II about what sort of magistrates Hong Kong wanted. And there was a point of view that they should be legally qualified barristers, as they were in London and Manchester and some other places. But there was also a view that it was more important for them to know Chinese, to understand Chinese, and to know what was going on in Hong Kong. Now, how to become a magistrate? Well, you might be brought over here from England as a barrister, but they tended not to last very long. They either went into private practice because there was more money to be made, or they got so overwhelmed by the work that they went on to other things. The professionalization took place in 1939, and it was a kind of empire-wide professionalization to accommodate what was then called the Colonial Legal Service, which was a cadre of legally qualified people who would move around the colonies as attorneys general, as magistrates, and as judges. In 1939, the immediate result in Hong Kong was the appointment of a lot of local lawyers to the magistrates' bench. And from then on, apart from JPs who were part-time and did very low-level justice, I think it's right to say that all magistrates were then legally qualified. But even after World War II, as some people will remember, right up to quite recent times, a large proportion of the magistracy was occupied by foreigners. And unlike the cadet officers who I've described, who were very well trained in Chinese, they would do 2 or 3 years full-time Chinese training. Unlike them, the magistrates brought in from the UK or Australia or from other colonies didn't really know the Hong Kong at all, and the experience was very varied. Some were very good, others not so good, depending on your viewpoint, of course.
Thanks, Chris. We've got time for a couple more questions. Does anyone else want to? Yes?
Just wondering whether you could comment on Hung Yi Guk or Kowloon City, what was happening there, and whether this system actually could reach its arm into any of those areas at that time.
That's a good question. May or Chris?
Well, the Hung Yi Guk being the Council of Representatives from the New Territories, the New Territories was gradually incorporated into Hong Kong after it was leased in 1898. And the practice was to give judicial powers to the district officers who worked from Tai Po or Yuen Long or from Central in Islands District, and they would be given judicial powers. Again, they were usually cadets, and this was the practice until the mid-1950s, when the New Territories magistracy was fully professionalized. Kowloon Walled City there was always tension over who had jurisdiction there. And the matter was finally resolved in the late 1950s when a case, I think, went to the Privy Council, if not the Privy Council, to appeal in Hong Kong. The defense argument, it was a murder case in an opium divan, where else? The defense argument was that because of the agreement, the Convention of Peking, the walled city was not under British jurisdiction, but the ruling was that it very definitely was. But even before then, I think the colonial authorities were extending their policing and other powers into that place.
Any more questions? Yes.
I'd be grateful if you'd permit me to make a comment rather than ask a question. I worked in Central Police Station in the early 1960s for several years. In those days, it wasn't the splendid building it is now. It leaked like a sieve, and bits kept falling off. Now you have this magnificent courtyard, a square. It was a chaotic car park. Everybody trying to get official vehicles in or their private cars in, it was chaotic. The good thing about Central Police Station, it was Hong Kong's headquarters for rumours, with so many different police units there, and the courts and the prisons, anything that was going on, we got to gossip about it. And you can imagine on those beautiful verandas the stories that got around. So there was an upside and a downside, but it was great fun to be there.
Great. I think we've got time for one last question if anyone is aching to ask, and then I think we'll call it a day after that. The lady there with the green shirt.
Thank you for your wonderful sharing on this book. And besides the magistrate you shared, and I hear that some of the director of the prisons or even the superintendent of police were also cadet officers. And I think it is a very interesting topic. Have you come across it? Thank you.
One of the people who highlighted in the book is the superintendent of police, Walter Meredith Dean. He was a cadet and was eventually the longest serving police chief in Hong Kong history. He went to St. Paul's and Cambridge, and the whole time he was in the police force, he was subject to criticism for his getting his knowledge out of books, and for his lack of practical sense and his lack of judgment. He stuck in there. He was a square peg in a round hole. I like him for that reason. Other cadets?
Yes, I think you raise a very good point. Another one was Charles Messer, who was chief of police, superintendent of the jail in the early 20th century. His career came to a fairly abrupt end after a load of money went missing in the treasury, of which he happened to be in charge as colonial treasurer. And at that time, you were held responsible if money disappeared under your watch. So he didn't have a very glorious career, although he rose to very high levels. And I think you could probably name half a dozen or 10 others who fit the bill that you've described. I'm not going to name them because time is short.
Okay, I'm just going to finish up by asking the authors a very quick question about who who was their favourite character or favourite part of the book when they were doing the research for the book. Maybe David first?
I was just looking at the pictures. So I think the handsomest. I think of the people who I found most interesting, if I could go and meet somebody, it would have been James Norman, I think. Okay. And just to hear, he was the one who was imprisoned in his own prison, and just to hear how that shaped his dealings with the prison system going forwards, whether it changed him in any way.
May? Any favourites?
I've already mentioned him, Walter Meredith Dean, because he didn't fit his job very well. He was criticized constantly. I find that somehow very touching. That there's some psychological depth to this character. And you like him for all his flaws.
Great. Thank you, May. And Chris.
I would go for Mr. Wong Guong, who was a prisoner who led a murderous escape from the jail in 1919 and was captured a few days later. And when he appeared before the magistrate, he gave a very, very long speech about how dreadful the conditions in the jail were, how the prisoners were starving and how they were treated badly by the prison warders. I don't say I like the man, and I probably would want police protection if I ever did meet him, but I think his speech before the magistrates, although it may have been exaggerated, I think it threw a lot of light on what was really going on in the jail at the time. This was about 1919.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, May, Chris, and David, and a huge thanks to Tai Kwun for Tim and for everyone who's supported us for the event tonight and also for the book. And thank you all very much for coming along this evening.